And so the United States supply chain just experienced something that experts have been warning about for months, but nobody in Washington wanted to believe could actually happen. Canada, after being pushed beyond any reasonable limit, has walked away from critical supply agreements that keep American factories running, store shelves stocked, and infrastructure projects moving forward. This is not another round of diplomatic posturing or threats that fade after a news cycle. Canadian officials announced yesterday that they are withdrawing from peace supply chain coordination agreements, halting several joint infrastructure projects and implementing new restrictions on exports of critical materials that American industries depend on every single day. It is honestly hard to believe that we have reached the point where America's most reliable trading partner has decided that continuing normal business operations with the current administration is simply too risky to maintain. This is not about politics in the usual sense. We are talking about automobile plants that will run out of parts within days, construction projects grinding to a halt because materials are not crossing the border, and energy systems that suddenly face uncertainty about supplies that were taken for granted for decades. And right now, corporate boardrooms across America are in emergency meetings trying to figure out how to keep operations going when the supply lines they built their entire business models around have just been severed. Before we dive deeper into how this happened and what it means for everyday Americans, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, because we're going to break down the real story behind the headlines and explain why this represents one of the most serious economic disruptions in modern American history. Let me walk you through exactly what led to this moment and why. And that is so much more than most people realize. Canada and the United States have spent more than 70 years building the most integrated trading relationship that exists anywhere in the world. And this is not like trade with China, where goods are manufactured overseas and shipped to American ports. And this is not like trade with Europe, where products are made in one place and sold in another. The relationship with Canada is fundamentally different because the two economies are woven together at every level. Raw materials cross the border to become components, and those components cross back to become subassemblies. Those subassemblies return again to become finished products. A single automobile can have parts that cross the border 6 or 7 times during the manufacturing process. And the same is true for aerospace components, agricultural machinery, construction equipment, and countless other products that Americans use every day without thinking about where they came from or how they were made. This integration happened gradually over generations as companies on both sides of the border figured out how to maximize efficiency by treating North America as a single economic zone. Canadian resources combined with American manufacturing capacity and Mexican labor created supply chains that made all free countries more competitive globally. The system worked because all free governments maintained stable, predictable policies that allowed businesses to make long-term investments with confidence. Trade agreements were negotiated and honored, and regulations were harmonized so that products meeting standards in one country could move freely to another. Border infrastructure was constantly improved to reduce delays and costs. Dispute resolution mechanisms were established so that disagreements could be handled without disrupting commerce. The whole edifice rested on a foundation of trust that political leaders would act rationally and that economic relationships would be managed by people who understood how deeply interconnected everything had become. But here is where the situation started to deteriorate in ways that few people anticipated. Donald Trump returned to power with a very different view of how trade relationships should function. From his perspective, any trade deficit represents America losing, any successful foreign company represents American failure, and any cooperative agreement represents American weakness. He has spent his entire political career arguing that the United States has been taken advantage of by every trading partner, that previous administrations were too soft or too stupid to negotiate good deals, and that only aggressive tactics can force other countries to treat America fairly. That worldview might make for effective political rhetoric, but it collides directly with the reality of how modern supply chains actually function. We are now more than a year into Trump applying that worldview to Canada. Specifically, he has imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, claiming they represent national security threats. Despite the fact that Canadian metals are integrated into American defense manufacturing, he has threatened tariffs on Canadian automobiles and auto parts, even though American companies own many of the factories producing those goods, and American workers depend on the integrated supply chain. He has suggested that Canadian lumber and dairy products are being dumped into American markets unfairly, even though trade agreements negotiated by previous administrations already addressed those issues. He has accused Canada of allowing Chinese goods to flow through its territory into the United States, turning border security into yet another source of tension. Every few weeks brings a new threat, a new accusation, a new demand that Canada change its policies to satisfy Trump's perception that America is being treated unfairly. And the Canadian government tried every possible response short of capitulation. Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet explained repeatedly how integrated the supply chains are and how disrupting them would hurt American workers and businesses just as much as Canadian ones. Canadian officials travel to Washington to meet with members of Congress, administration officials, and business leaders to present detailed economic data showing the mutual benefits of the trading relationship. Canadian premiers from provinces that trade heavily with specific American states reached out to governors and state legislators to explain the local impact of potential disruptions. Trade associations on both sides of the border coordinated campaigns to educate policymakers about supply chain dependencies. The message was consistent and backed by extensive evidence. Disrupting the Canada's United States trading relationship would not make America stronger or richer. It would make both countries poorer and less secure. But here is what changed everything and finally pushed Canada past the breaking point. Last week, Trump issued what he called his final demand to Canada. He insisted that, and Canada agreed to limit its exports of certain critical materials to the United States unless American companies were given preferential access to Canadian resources at below market prices. This was not a negotiation. This was not a proposal to discuss how to manage shared resources. This was a demand that Canada subordinate its economic sovereignty to American political preferences. Trump gave Canada 72 hours to agree or face immediate comprehensive tariffs on virtually all Canadian goods entering the United States. The demand was unprecedented in modern relations between the two countries. No American president had ever suggested that Canada should be forced to sell its resources below market value. No previous administration had tried to use trade policy to essentially expropriate in other countries' natural wealth. The demand revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how sovereign nations function and how modern economies operate. Canadian officials knew immediately that complying was impossible. Agreeing to Trump's demand would mean Canadian companies losing billions of dollars. It would mean Canadian workers losing jobs as resource industries became unprofitable. And it would mean setting a precedent that any time America wanted better terms, Canada would simply surrender its interests. But more fundamentally, it would mean abandoning any pretense that Canada was an independent nation with the right to manage its own economy. The choice Canada faced was stark: submit to terms that would damage Canadian prosperity and sovereignty, or refuse and face the economic consequences of comprehensive American tariffs. There was no middle ground. Trump had deliberately structured the demand to force complete compliance or total confrontation. As the deadline approached, Trudeau consulted with premiers from all provinces, met with business leaders and labor unions, spoke with opposition party leaders to ensure national unity, and coordinated with allies internationally to explain what was happening and prepare for potential economic fallout. The decision that emerged was unanimous across Canadian political and business leadership. Canada would not comply with the demand. Instead, Canada would take its own steps to protect its economy from the chaos that American policy had created. The announcement came 12 hours before Trump's deadline expired. Trudeau addressed the nation and explained that Canada had been left with no choice but to withdraw from voluntary supply chain agreements that required trust and cooperation. He made clear that Canada was not cutting off trade entirely, was not imposing retaliatory tariffs immediately, and remained willing to negotiate in good faith if the United States returned to rational policymaking. but Canada would no longer operate under agreements that assumed American reliability when that assumption had been proven false repeatedly. The specific steps Canada announced were carefully chosen to protect Canadian interests while demonstrating the seriousness of the situation. Several joint infrastructure projects that facilitate cross-border commerce were suspended indefinitely. These include bridge and tunnel upgrades that were being jointly funded, customs pre-clearance facilities that speed up border crossings and harmonize trucking regulations that allow seamless movement of goods, energy export agreements that had guaranteed stable supplies to American markets were revised to remove the guaranteed minimum volumes, meaning Canadian energy could be redirected to other markets if more profitable or strategically advantageous. Critical materials, including rare earth elements, potash, and specialized minerals that American tech and defense industries depend on, were placed under new export review requirements that would slow shipments and create uncertainty. Just in time, manufacturing agreements that allowed automotive and aerospace parts to move across the border with minimal inspection were terminated, meaning every shipment would now face full customs procedures and potential delays. The impact on American supply chains was immediate and severe. Within hours, major manufacturers started reporting disruptions. Automobile plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky that depend on Canadian-made engines, transmissions, and electrical systems received notices that shipments were delayed indefinitely at the border due to new inspection requirements. Construction projects across the northern United States that were using Canadian steel lumber ground to a halt as materials that were supposed to arrive did not show up, and alternatives could not be sourced quickly enough. Energy markets reacted with volatility as traders tried to price in the risk that Canadian oil and natural gas might not flow in predictable volumes. Technology manufacturers that depend on Canadian minerals for semiconductors and batteries started calculating how many days or weeks of inventory they had before production would have to stop. The panic spread through corporate America faster than most people anticipated. Chief executives who had stayed quiet during previous trade disputes started making urgent calls to Congress and the White House. They were not making political arguments. They were presenting operational reality. Their factories would shut down not in months, but in days if the supply disruptions continued. Their workers would be sent home. Their customers would not receive products, and their competitors in Europe and Asia who were not dealing with this chaos would gain market share that might never be recovered. The Chamber of Commerce released an emergency statement calling the situation a crisis of the administration's own making, and the National Association of Manufacturers published data showing that hundreds of thousands of American jobs were directly at risk within the first month if normal supply flows did not resume. Now, this is not the first time Trump has created economic chaos through trade policy, and we have seen this pattern of recklessness before with other countries. His approach to trade really only considers immediate political benefits and has no concern longer-term economic consequences. Whenever he faces political pressure or wants to demonstrate toughness to his base, he threatens trade wars regardless of the damage. And we have spotted this pattern repeatedly over the past several years. Just think about how he handled trade with China. Trump imposed tariffs that were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America and force China to change its economic system. And what actually happened was that American farmers lost their largest export market. American consumers paid higher prices for everyday goods, and manufacturing did not return because supply chains cannot be rebuilt overnight through political decree. The trade war cost the American economy hundreds of billions of dollars and required massive government bailouts to farmers who suffered the most. Then there was the approach to Mexico. Trump threatened to close the southern border entirely and impose escalating tariffs unless Mexico solved the immigration challenges that the United States itself had largely created through decades of failed policy. The threat caused chaos in supply chains that depend on Mexican manufacturing. Automotive companies warned that production would halt within hours if the border closed. Agricultural producers said fresh produce would rot in warehouses. The business community revolted so strongly that Trump backed down, but not before creating weeks of uncertainty that cost companies millions in contingency planning and delayed investments. And let us not forget the steel and aluminum tariffs that Trump imposed on allies around the world, claiming they were necessary for national security. And the tariffs raise costs for American manufacturers, use those materials, cost jobs in industries that depend on affordable metals, and provoke retaliation from allies who impose their own tariffs on American agricultural and industrial products. Even Trump's own Commerce Department studies showed that the tariffs cost the economy more than they generated in revenue or protected jobs. Even the renegotiation of NAFTA into the new USMCA agreement, which Trump claimed as a major victory, created enormous uncertainty for businesses during the negotiation period and resulted in an agreement that was largely similar to what existed before, just with a different name and some minor adjustments. The main accomplishment was creating months of chaos that businesses had to navigate without knowing what rules would govern their operations. Now, Canada has been subjected to the same pattern of threats and instability, but this time the stakes are even higher because of how essential Canadian supplies are to American operations. This pattern is clear and consistent. Trump used trade relationships as contests where someone wins and someone loses, not as mutually beneficial arrangements where both sides gain. He believes that threats and chaos give America leverage when in reality they just make America a less reliable partner that others will avoid when they have alternatives. The relationship becomes hostile and unpredictable when it should be stable and cooperative. So, what did Canada do to deserve Trump's final ultimatum? The answer reveals just how unreasonable the demand actually was. It all boils down to Trump wanting to claim a victory over Canada, regardless of economic reality or basic fairness. The specific demand about critical materials was not based on any legitimate American need. The United States was already purchasing Canadian resources at market prices. American companies had secure access to supplies. There was no shortage or crisis that required intervention. Trump simply decided that Canada should be forced to give American companies preferential treatment, selling resources below market value, and essentially subsidizing American industries at Canada's expense. The situation escalated because Trump has a psychological need to be seen as dominating other leaders and forcing concessions, and his political brand depends on creating the perception that he wins every negotiation and that other countries fear him when Canada refused to simply accept his characterization of the trading relationship as unfair. When Canadian officials pushed back with facts and data, Trump took it as a personal challenge that required escalation. Ultimately, Trump issued his 72-hour ultimatum, not because American interests required it, but because he wanted to force Canada into visible submission. As a sovereign nation with its own economic interests to protect, Canada decided to call the bluff rather than surrender. Trudeau and his government took a measured but firm stance. They made clear that Canada would not be bullied into agreements that violated basic sovereignty. They explained that the trading relationship had to be based on mutual benefit and respect, not on one country demanding subordination from the other. Their approach was to demonstrate that Canada has agency and options, that the relationship works because both sides benefit, and that treating a partner with contempt will eventually cost you that partnership. At first, many observers in Washington assumed Canada was just posturing and would ultimately back down when faced with the threat of American tariffs. This assumption reflected a deep misunderstanding of both Canadian politics and economics, and Trudeau could not have complied with Trump's demand even if he wanted to. The Canadian public would not have accepted such a humiliating surrender. Canadian businesses would not have cooperated with arrangements that destroyed their profitability. Provincial governments that control many natural resources would have refused to implement terms that harmed their economies. Compliance was never actually an option, which meant Trump's ultimatum was guaranteed to produce confrontation. But here is where Trump's calculation went catastrophically wrong. When Canada responded by withdrawing from voluntary supply agreements, the impact on American operations was far more severe and immediate than anyone in the administration had anticipated. You see, Trump and his advisors fundamentally misunderstood how dependent American supply chains had become on Canadian reliability. They assumed that because America is the larger economy, it automatically has more leverage. They did not understand that in deeply integrated supply chains, the country supplying critical inputs at key points in the production process often has more practical leverage than the final market. They did not consider that American factories designed around just in time delivery of Canadian parts cannot simply switch to other suppliers overnight. Modern manufacturing depends on precision timing, so components need to arrive exactly when they are needed, not earlier because storing inventory is expensive, and not later because production lines cannot sit idle. That system only works when suppliers are reliable and predictable. And when Canada announced that shipments would now face enhanced review and inspection, that predictability vanished. Suddenly, a component that used to take 6 hours to cross the border might take 6 days. Factories that kept minimal inventory because they trusted deliveries would arrive on schedule now face the choice of shutting down production or somehow sourcing alternatives that did not exist. The energy sector faced similar disruption. American refineries on the Gulf Coast are specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude oil, and they cannot simply switch to other types of oil without expensive modifications that take months or years. When Canada announced that guaranteed minimum export volumes were being removed, and those refineries faced the possibility that their feedstock might not arrive in sufficient quantities. Natural gas supplies that keep electricity prices stable in the Northeast flow from Canada through pipelines that have no alternative sources. When those supplies become uncertain, energy markets react with price increases that hit consumers directly. As these realities became clear, something happened that Trump rarely experiences. His own political coalition started fracturing over the consequences of his policies. This was not just Democrats criticizing his approach. This was Republican senators from states facing immediate economic harm, saying publicly that the situation needed to be resolved immediately. This was business leaders who had supported Trump financially now saying his trade policy was destroying the industries they built over decades. And this was farmers facing bankruptcy because Canadian retaliation was cutting off critical export markets. This was labor unions representing workers who were about to be laid off, demanding that the administration change course. Now, this left Trump in an extremely difficult position without obvious escape routes. On one side, he had spent weeks building up his ultimatum to Canada as a defining test of American strength. He told his supporters that Canada would have to comply, that he was forcing a deal, that previous presidents were too weak to demand that this would prove his deal-making abilities. His entire political identity is wrapped up in the image of never backing down and always winning. On the flip side, he was now facing economic catastrophe that was unfolding in real time and could not be hidden or spun away. Factories were actually shutting down. Workers were actually being sent home. The prices were actually rising, and the stock market was actually falling. Corporate leaders were actually demanding action. The impossible choice he created was becoming a crisis with genuine political costs. He could double down and implement the comprehensive tariffs he had threatened, which would accelerate the economic damage and vindicate everyone who warned that his approach was reckless and destructive. Or he could try to negotiate some way out of the crisis, which would require effectively admitting that his ultimatum failed and that Canada successfully called his bluff. Neither option was politically acceptable, but doing nothing was not an option either, because the economic pain was mounting by the hour. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is that Trump's usual tactic of changing the subject and creating a new controversy to distract attention is not working. The supply chain disruptions are too visible and too painful. When someone cannot buy a car because the factory is not producing, they notice when someone's heating costs jump because energy supplies are uncertain. They notice when someone loses their job because the plant where they work cannot get the components needed to operate. They definitely notice this is not abstract policy that people can ignore. This is concrete harm showing up in their daily lives. What we are witnessing now is a fracturing that goes beyond the immediate supply chain crisis. This is a moment where multiple parts of American society are simultaneously realizing that the emperor has no clothes. Business leaders are confronting the reality that loyalty to Trump has cost them financially and operationally. They built their companies on stable relationships and predictable trade rules, and those have been shattered for no legitimate business reason. And workers are realizing that the promises of bringing manufacturing back and creating great jobs were empty when the actual result is layoffs and instability. They were told that getting tough with trading partners would help them, but instead, it has destroyed the supply chains that provided their employment.